The room was silent. Then the black hood dropped over his face and 5 rifles took aim at his chest. Ronnie Lee Gardner didn't just accept death. He demanded it, not by lethal injection, not in silence. He chose to die in a blaze of bullets by one of the most controversial execution methods in American history, the firing squad. This is the chilling countdown to one of the most violent inmates ever put to death. A man who killed in cold blood during a courtroom escape, taunted the justice system for decades, and then faced 5 loaded guns without flinching. But what happened in the final hours before those fatal shots were fired will leave you stunned. Ronnie Lee Gardner was born in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1961, but from the very start, life dealt him cruelty. He grew up in a household filled with violence, drugs, and emotional neglect. His father was largely absent. His mother was often high. At just 4 years old, he was reportedly tied to a radiator and beaten with belts. By age 6, he had been shuffled through multiple foster homes, each one more chaotic than the last. Some reports claimed he was sexually abused. Others said he would show up at school with bruises, burns, and torn clothes. He started sniffing glue by age 8, smoking meth by 9. His first arrest came at age 10 for stealing food from a gas station. Not out of rebellion, but hunger. By his teens, Ronnie was a full-blown heroin addict, sleeping on floors, robbing strangers, and bouncing between juvenile detention centers and state-run facilities. Social workers wrote him off as a lost cause. The system failed him, and eventually he failed everyone around him. In 1984, at age 23, Gardner was desperate, broke, addicted, and spiraling out of control. He made a decision that would seal his fate. He needed drug money and fast, and targeted a small bar in Salt Lake City that he believed would have cash on hand after closing. That bar was run by Melvin Otterstrom, a kind and well-liked bartender known for staying late to clean up. As Otterstrom was locking up for the night, Gardner stormed in, brandishing a pistol. He demanded money, and Otterstrom complied, but Gardner shot him anyway, point blank, before fleeing the scene. Witnesses later testified that Gardner calmly wiped down the counter, stepped over the body, and disappeared into the night with the cash register drawer. The murder was cold, calculated, and senseless. The community was horrified, and the manhunt was immediate. Police launched a full-scale search within hours. Tips poured in. Gardner had vanished into the dark streets of Salt Lake City, but not for long. Just 2 days later, officers tracked him to a rundown apartment complex on the west side of town. He was hiding in a friend's unit, passed out on the floor with a needle still in his arm. When police kicked in the door, Gardner didn't resist. He was arrested on the spot. Dazed, bloodshot, barely aware of where he was. But the damage had already been done. Melvin Otterstrom was dead, and Ronnie Lee Gardner was now facing murder charges that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While awaiting trial for Otterstrom's murder, Gardner was transported to a courthouse for what should have been a routine hearing. But what happened next turned a cold-blooded killer into a national spectacle. As he stood shackled in the hallway, an accomplice slipped him a handgun, smuggled past security, and tucked into a rolled-up magazine. Gardner didn't hesitate. In a flash, he broke free from the guards, grabbed the weapon, and fired. Panic erupted. Screams echoed through the marble corridors. A bailiff went down. Another man was hit. And in the chaos, Gardner turned and aimed, shooting attorney Michael Burdell point-blank in the face. Burdell, who had no connection to Gardner's case, died instantly. Gardner bolted for the exit, blood on the floor, people diving for cover. Courtroom doors slammed shut. He made it just a few feet from the entrance before he was tackled by a swarm of deputies. One man dead, several injured, a courthouse in lockdown. And by the next morning, Gardner's face was plastered across every major news outlet in the country. He was convicted of 2 murders and sentenced to death. But what he asked for next stunned even the most hardened prosecutors. He chose the firing squad. From the mid-1980s through the 2000s, Gardner became the poster child for a death penalty system stuck in endless limbo. His legal team filed appeal after appeal, citing everything from due process violations to questions about his mental state. He became notorious for manipulating the system, buying himself years, then decades on death row. During that time, Gardner continued to live in chaos. He orchestrated another escape attempt, this time scaling a recreation yard fence before being tackled just feet from freedom. He fashioned a deadly shank from a metal rod and stabbed a fellow inmate during a prison altercation. He assaulted multiple guards, leaving one with permanent injuries. Some corrections officers refused to be alone near his cell. Yet behind bars, Gardner also lived a double life. He studied law books obsessively, eventually assisting other inmates with appeals. He painted haunting images, mostly in black and red, which he sold to true crime collectors. He practiced meditation and gave cryptic interviews to journalists, presenting himself as reformed, or at least enlightened. He was feared, hated, admired, and mythologized. But one thing never changed: the execution date. It kept moving, retreating behind legal motions and bureaucratic delay, until it didn't. June 17, 2010. Ronnie Lee Gardner was 49 years old. He had spent half his life behind bars. And now, after 25 years of legal battles and headlines, it had come to this: a chair, a target, a bullet. His execution was set for just after midnight. The first by firing squad in the United States in over a decade. Gardner had deliberately chosen this method, not only because it was legal in Utah, but because he believed it was quicker, more certain, and more honorable than lethal injection. He even said publicly that it was a form of redemption, that he wanted to go out facing the bullets, not fading away with chemicals. To many, it was a final act of defiance. To others, it was the ultimate submission to a brutal justice system. The weight of history, and 5 rounds of live ammunition, was about to fall on his chest. At 12:01 a.m., Gardner sat down for a final meal that felt more like a ritual. A thick-cut steak, lobster tails soaked in butter, a wedge of warm apple pie, vanilla ice cream, and a chilled can of 7-Up. The tray had been prepared days in advance, then refrigerated as Utah's policy required. Gardner ate it slowly, methodically, savoring each bite as though trying to delay time itself. He hadn't eaten in 2 days, not because food wasn't available, but because he chose to fast. It was part of a spiritual ritual Gardner had adopted in his final days. He spent hours in meditation, sitting on the thin mattress of his cell with his eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady. The television remained off, the radio silent. His legal team had been instructed: no appeals, no delays, no more visits unless absolutely necessary. He wanted stillness, control. He wanted to die on his own terms. The lights in his cell dimmed around 10 p.m., but Gardner didn't sleep. Instead, he sat cross-legged, staring at the concrete wall, whispering prayers to no one in particular. It was the first time guards would later say that they saw him still for so long. In his final hours, Gardner was granted 2 private visits, one with his attorney, the other with a local bishop. The attorney described the conversation as surreal, quiet, reflective, almost peaceful. The bishop would later say Gardner spoke more about his childhood than his crimes. "I didn't start out bad," he told him. "I just never had a chance." Even the correctional officers, many of whom had spent years managing his violent outbursts, were stunned by his calm. One guard reportedly walked away visibly shaken, saying, "He looked ready, like he'd already left this place. When asked if he had any final words, Gardner simply nodded and said, "I'm ready. I made peace." At approximately 12:10 a.m., he was escorted down the corridor, known among guards as the Last Walk. His footsteps echoed against the concrete. No words were spoken. The only sound, the rhythmic jangle of chains brushing his legs. The execution chamber was clinical and cold. A steel chair bolted to the floor, 4 sandbags behind him to absorb the bullets, a paper target pinned over his heart. He declined a blindfold. He wanted to see nothing and everything. As he sat, one guard gently pulled the black hood down over his face. The air was thick with tension. Even the witnesses behind the glass seemed to hold their breath. On the other side of the brick wall, 5 anonymous men gripped their Winchester Model 70 bolt-action rifles, weapons long associated with military precision and state-sanctioned executions in Utah. Each rifle was fitted with a .30 caliber cartridge, a round powerful enough to tear through bone and vital organs with lethal force. 4 of the rifles were loaded with live ammunition. The 5th contained a blank, a psychological buffer to spare at least one marksman from the certainty of having fired the fatal shot. Each man was selected by prison officials and kept anonymous, hidden behind a curtain of secrecy and the weight of their task. None of them would ever know who truly ended Gardner's life. That burden was buried with the bullets. The warden's voice broke the silence. "Ready, aim, fire!" A deafening crack echoed through the room. Gardner's body jolted. A bloom of red soaked through the center of his chest. His arms went slack. His head fell forward. A prison physician stepped forward, checked for a pulse, and nodded. Ronnie Lee Gardner was pronounced dead at 12:20 a.m. His story ended with 5 bullets, but for many, the shock of how it ended has never faded. Gardner's execution didn't just make headlines, it set off a firestorm. Protesters swarmed the prison gates, holding candles, banners, and signs drenched in blood-red ink that screamed state-sanctioned murder. Reporters from across the nation descended on Utah, broadcasting live outside the facility where 5 rifles had just ended a man's life. The public was split. Some were horrified by what they saw as a medieval execution tactic, likening it to a spectacle ripped straight from a dystopian novel. Others called it swift justice, a long overdue punishment for a man who had terrorized and manipulated the system for decades. Under pressure, Utah banned the firing squad not long after, only to quietly reinstate it years later when lethal injection drugs became harder to obtain. Ironically, the method Gardner had chosen to make a statement became a fallback option for the state. In the end, Ronnie Lee Gardner became more than just a killer on death row. He became a symbol, a lightning rod for controversy, the final face of a punishment method most believed had already died out. A man who demanded bullets and got them. Subscribe to Death Row Stories for more real cases, haunting last words, and the brutal truth behind final executions.